So let's talk about something that seems super simple on the surface. What actually causes a disaster? Your first thought is probably, a hurricane, a flood, an earthquake. But what if I told you that's only part of the story? We're going to dive into this because the way experts think about disasters has completely flipped on its head over the years.
Okay, let's start with a little thought experiment. Picture a massive earthquake, a real monster quake, but it happens in the middle of a totally empty desert. No people, no towns, nothing for hundreds of miles. So, is that a disaster? Sure, the ground shook like crazy, but if nobody and nothing was affected, did a disaster even happen? That question right there is the key to this whole shift in thinking we're about to explore.
For the longest time, the answer was pretty simple. A disaster was caused by the event itself. A disaster happened because a flood happened. End of story. And so the entire focus for organizations was just on dealing with that one big bad moment and its immediate aftermath. But, as people responded to more and more of these events, they started to notice something really important. Just reacting to the crisis over and over again, it just wasn't cutting it. They realized that what happens before a hazard ever hits and what happens long, long after the cameras leave are just as crucial as the immediate response. This new way of looking at things led to a much smarter approach. Instead of just seeing a disaster as this single terrible point on a timeline, experts began to see it as a continuous loop. They called it the disaster management cycle. And this is what that thinking looks like. It's called the continuum model. The whole idea here is that a disaster isn't a one-and-done event. It's a cycle. How a community recovers from one crisis directly affects how it prepares for the next one. It's all connected, which was a huge step up from just reacting when things go wrong. This cycle gets broken down into 4 key stages. First up is mitigation. That's all the stuff you do to try and lessen the impact, like building a seawall. Then you've got preparedness. This is your game plan, like having early warning systems in place. Third is the response, which is exactly what it sounds like, the immediate action to save lives. And finally, recovery, the long, slow process of rebuilding. Now, don't get me wrong, this cycle model was a really big deal. It made people think ahead, to prepare, to consider long-term recovery, but it had one massive, fundamental flaw baked right into it. By focusing so much on managing the cycle, it just assumes that the disaster is going to happen no matter what. It treats it as some unavoidable act of God that we just have to get better at cleaning up. But then some people started questioning that assumption. And that's when the biggest breakthrough in disaster theory happened. A totally new model came along that didn't just ask how to manage a disaster. It asked a much deeper question. Why do disasters happen in the first place? And here it is, the answer in one incredibly powerful equation that completely changed the game. A disaster is not just a hazard. A disaster only happens when a hazard, like a flood, hits a community that is vulnerable to it. The hazard is just the trigger. The vulnerability that was already there, that's the real cause. This idea is captured perfectly in what's called the crunch model. Think about it. On one side, you have the hazard. Let's say it's a flood. And on the other side, you have all these vulnerable conditions. People living on a floodplain maybe, or their crops can't handle the water. The disaster is the crunch that happens when those two things slam into each other. Okay, so vulnerability is the real smoking gun here. Where does it come from? It's not just random, it's not just bad luck. The crunch model shows us that vulnerability is actually the final link in a whole chain of underlying pressures. This progression of vulnerability model really lays it out. It shows that vulnerability is a process. It's like a set of dominoes falling. It starts with these big, deep-seated root causes, which then create what are called dynamic pressures, which then finally result in the unsafe conditions that put people right in harm's way. Let's unpack that a little. Root causes are the big structural things in the society, like how power, money, and resources are spread around. These then lead to dynamic pressures, things like a lack of good schools or no one investing in a certain area. And those pressures are what create the unsafe conditions on the ground, the real, tangible things that make people vulnerable. So what do these unsafe conditions actually look like in real life? Well, they look like a family being forced to build a home right on a riverbank because they have no other options. It's a town that has no way of getting reliable warnings about a coming storm. It's farmers planting the only crops they can afford, knowing they'll be wiped out by the first flood. It's these things that turn a bad storm into a total catastrophe. So why is this shift in thinking so important? Why does it matter if we see it as a cycle or as a vulnerability problem? because it completely redefines the goal. Instead of just getting better at preparing for a disaster, we can actually start working to prevent it from happening at all. The focus shifts from the hazard to the people. I mean, look at the difference when you put them side by side. The old cyclical model, it's all about the hazard. It assumes disasters are just gonna happen, and the best we can do is manage the mess. But the crunch model, it focuses on why people are vulnerable in the first place. It sees disasters as something we can actually prevent, and the goal becomes fixing those unsafe conditions before the hazard even shows up. Here's probably the best way to think about it. The old model is all about treating the symptom, the flood itself. This new way of thinking is about addressing the underlying disease, all the complex social and economic reasons that put people in the flood's path to begin with. And this all brings us to the most powerful and, honestly, the most important conclusion of all. Earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, these things are natural. They're part of how our planet works. But the disasters they cause, those are not natural at all. They are the result of human systems, of choices, and of vulnerability. In a very real way, disasters are man-made. And so that leaves us with one last thing to think about. This isn't just some abstract theory. Every single community, maybe even your own, has hidden vulnerabilities. So what are the unsafe conditions where you live? And maybe even more important, what are the root causes that created them? The answers might just surprise you.